This is Jason with devslopes.com, and in this video we are going to begin building the first section right here of our website. Okay, a couple of things that I want to point out here. So you'll notice that this first section has a gradient background. You can see that it starts from a light blue and goes into a dark blue. So we're going to be working with gradients here. You'll also notice that the content is split up onto two sides, so we're going to be using columns here. Alright, so let's start out with the first thing is we are going to build a section container right here, and we're going to make two columns. Alright, moving this off to the side, and let's dive in over here. So each section that we build, I like to put into a container. And what I mean by that is I like to create one default standard container class that contains all the rows and columns that I'm going to be putting inside there to lay out my elements. And I'm going to do that section by section. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a div tag and add a class of container to it. Okay, close that off, open it up, and then we're going to come over here and start adding our container class. So go ahead and create a class of container. And here's what we want to happen. We know that each section that we're working with, we want to have a width of 100%. We always want to have it take up the full display of the screen, whether that's on a desktop or mobile. The next thing that I want to add here is a property that's going to help us center the content inside of our container. And to do that, I'm going to add a margin of auto. Okay? And what this does is adding a margin of auto is going to take all the elements that are within our container. It's going to see if there's any extra space that hasn't been accounted for, like if margins are different on certain elements, and it's going to take that extra space, it's going to split it in two, and it's going to put it on an even distribution on the left and right side of our container. That way it helps keep everything in the center. Really cool strategy to use there. I want to bring up our web page again, and I want you to notice something. Another thing that I like to do with containers is I like to add some padding to the top and bottom of every section. That way it just gives everything a little bit of space, so it's not so crowded. So you'll see that we've got some padding at the top and bottom here. Same with this section, same with this section. So we want to do the same thing with our container. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to add a padding top, and let's choose a small number, like 4%. there, and then we're going to add a padding bottom of 4% on the bottom. Just give it some even distribution. What we've done here is we've taken the container, our element, and with padding we've created space within the element, right? So it just adds this little fluff, this extra fluff to our container to help separate our sections. So cool. So we've added this to our container, and now that we've actually set technically a height to our container, why don't we go ahead and next add our background? That way we can kind of see what it's going to look like. By building this container, it's given us something to show up in. So to do that, since we want to add a gradient to this container, and only this container, we can actually use the ID selector, right? And traditionally I've said, oh, only use classes when you're using styling. But if we think about this, this gradient is only applied to this first container, this first section of our website. So it's okay in this case because it's very, very unique to use an ID. And to do that, let's go ahead and give this a name. I'm going to call this section 1 gradient. All right, very unique name, something that we can call it by. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And why don't we go ahead and put this gradient down here before our navigation bar. And before I paste it here, I'm going to just kind of comment out another section to organize this, because inside of here we are putting our custom styles. All right. So this, we're just breaking it up into categories to make it a little bit easier to organize this. So I'm going to go ahead and add my ID in here, paste in the name of it, add my curly brackets, and now we can add the gradient here. Now, gradients are obviously a little bit different from just a standard background, right? So what I'm going to do here is have you open up your web browser. Okay, and go ahead and just type in CSS gradients. All right, and W3 Schools has a really good explanation on this. I like to reference them a lot whenever I'm working with HTML elements or CSS style properties. If I have questions or need clarification on things, I enjoy coming to W3 Schools and seeing what they've got to say. So gradients, one thing to know is gradients don't work across all browsers, all right? Some of these weird third-party browsers might not pick up on the gradient property. Gradients came out and was introduced in CSS3. So until all the browsers adopt the gradient property, some of them might not support it. But we've done some cool things to really try to help browsers recognize the gradient property and to help apply it to the web browser. So you can see down here in browser support, the supported browsers that are here. And you can see each one of these browsers, it says the version of the browser it's supported on, and then it has a really cool key that will help the browser identify the gradient associated with Chrome, for an example. We've got Firefox, and you can see that we've got Opera. So let's come down a little bit further, and W3 Schools has given us an example about how you would put a gradient into your website. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and paste this, but in the future I would strongly recommend you never copy and paste things like CSS styles or JavaScript snippets or whatever and put it into your project, and I'm going to tell you why. So I'm going to go ahead and within my ID paste what we just copied here. Now, what could happen is if you're just doing these copy and pastes left and right, you might be adding these styles to a specific element, and then later on as you're building out the rest of your project, you might have certain elements that aren't being styled correctly. And the reason why is because if you're copying and pasting things without understanding what it is and how it's working, you could have these style properties, for an example, overriding other elements in your project. So understand how this works and anything works before you copy and paste it. So enough on that soapbox. Enough with that. Let's move on. So I'm going to explain what's happening through each one of these. So we've grabbed our ID here, and what we're saying is we want a background of red. And obviously we're going to be changing these colors to blue. I'm just going to use these colors for our example here. So we want the standard color, the background color, to be red for browsers that do not support gradients. Then we're going to grab WebKit, which we saw, right over here. It applies to Chrome and to Safari. We're going to grab WebKit to help the browser recognize this gradient, and we're going to put the property linear gradient, which is our top to bottom, and then in the parentheses we're putting the values of red and yellow. Okay, then we're grabbing the Opera and then Firefox, doing the same thing, and then this last background here is just a standard linear gradient with the colors in it, and it's going to try to apply it to all those weird third-party browsers out there, okay? And so that's what's happening in here. Now let's get this to add our blue colors. So let me go get our blue color here. Give me a second to find it. There it is. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. I don't have it memorized. And I'm going to select the red, double click. I'm going to hit the pound sign so I can add my hex code. And this blue right here, this lighter blue, is 076DFF. Okay? After you've written that in, go ahead and copy it. And this is going to be the first color in our gradient. So what we can do is we're going to double click on this red, hold down Command on a Mac or hold down Control on Windows, and double click the rest of the reds. And go ahead and paste the color we just copied here. All right, pretty cool. So we just took care of that in one blow. Let's go ahead and grab our other blue color. I'm going to double click on this yellow here, hit the pound sign, paste in the hex code, which is 65A5FF. And when you are done typing that in, copy it, and we're going to do the same thing here, highlight the yellows, and paste into it. All right, so now we should have this really, really cool blue showing up here. Let's go ahead and launch the project, see how it looks in our browser, and there it is. We've applied the ID to our container, and we've added a padding of top and bottom to give the container a height, and so our background gradient displays. Very cool. Let's start adding the rest of our content. Let's add the first two header tags that are in there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and make this smaller so we can work within here. And we're going to be adding rows and columns to this, okay? We're going to go ahead and add our div with a class of row. All right, cool. Open that up there. So let's go over to our styles over here and add our row. Now our row is going to be a default property, okay? So we know that, oops, what am I doing here? We know that every row we want to have a width of 100%. Okay, we also want to do a couple of other things with these rows. Now these rows need to flex as the display changes sizes. All right, so we're going to add a display of flex. And what this does is it's going to be able to latch onto and grab any elements that we put inside of our row that has flex on it, so it can help those things change size. Now, when we add a display of flex to a property, it allows us to add a few other special properties to that class. So one of those things that we can do is add a flex wrap and set it to a wrap. And what this does, spell that wrong, and what this does is all of the elements inside of this row, we're saying, hey, this container is flexing, and as everything is flexing and getting smaller, I want you to take the content and wrap it around underneath, okay? That way it helps shift our elements around. And then what I want to add is a, let's see, it's an align item, or align items, and then to center. And we can add this property because we're adding the flex property, and what that does is it helps take these items, any of the elements that are within this flex container, and it's going to help center that content out for us, okay? So that's all we want to do with the row, is allow it when it shrinks to help everything inside of it flex and wrap around and stay centered. If you remember when we were learning about the grid system, we also had this row after action thing that was happening here, right? And we add the after action to it. And what we want to do is with every row, just like we did when we learned about the grid system, is reset the row to clear out any of the content and just start with fresh new rows for our sections. And to do that, we gave it a display of table, and we're going to add a clear of both, if you remember, and that removes any floats that on any elements, so it's not inherited in the next row that we create. It removes the floats from the right and from the left. And then we want to clear out any of the content. We just want to start fresh every time. So we do content with an empty string. So that is that. And why don't we go ahead while we're doing this and create our columns. I'm going to paste this in, and then I'm going to give you a minute or two to pause the video and just quickly copy this down. All right, I assume you've paused and you're back now. All right, so let's begin. So remember, we're working with two columns in our first row in this first section. So let's create a div tag with the class of column 6, because column 6 is our width of 50%. It's just a split, even split down the middle there. All right, and then we'll open that up. And why don't we go ahead, I'm going to have you copy this, and then right under the closing tag of our first column, paste the second column. All right, and we're just going to work within this first column. We'll leave this one empty for now. All right, cool. So we've got our container, row, and a column. So we had some text, right, in our column. Let me pull this up for you. We'll go ahead and close out of this. Let's go ahead and create these two headers right here. All right. So inside of this column, I'm going to add a div tag, just an empty div tag. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to nest my header tags inside of this, because perhaps in the future I might want to work with the group of my header tags that are here in this column, and I might want to add a style property to this group, but right now I don't have one in mind, but this is planning ahead for the future just in case, and it's important to do this in your projects too. So I'm going to grab a header 1, and then we named this crazy radness. All right, and then in our second header tag we had made for developers. All right, cool. So now we've got our first header tags. Let's check this out. And that's cool. We've got some black text. It's looking a little bit small, and we need the text to be white. So let's work with that now. Back to our text editor. Now, regular header tags throughout our website, I want to stay the same size, but these particular headers, I want to interact and change them. So let's go ahead and add a class to this header tag, and I'm just going to call it large, because we want to make the text larger, so it makes sense in my head. All right, so we're going to add this class to both of these. Now let's scroll down to the bottom here, and we have our custom styles here. Right under our gradients, let's grab the element by its class. I keep adding that R. I keep wanting to say larger instead of large. So we definitely know that we want our color to be white. So let's add white. And then we want the font size to be bigger. So we're going to add a font 6. Just kidding. We're going to add a font size of, let's do 56 pixels. All right. Let's make this a little bit larger. Perfect. I like that. Now you might be wondering, well, Jason, why don't you just like create a label with a font size of 56 pixels? Well, the reason I want to use header 1 tags is header 1 tags by default, you can see, have this margin created around it. Labels or paragraph tags, they don't have a margin like a header 1 does, but I like the margin of a header 1 tag, so that's why I chose it. And then we're grabbing the class just to increase the font size. All right, so all of that is working out very nicely. Now there is 2 more things that I want to add to this. The margin, I feel like that it's putting around the element is a little bit too much for me. So I'm going to add a margin of 0. And now if we check this out, our text is right next to each other. So instead of a margin, because I don't want to create space between the elements, I'm actually going to increase the line height of it. And when we're working with fonts, it is much smarter to add space between text using a line height than margin. So we're going to do a line height, and I don't know, why don't we just spread it out like 20 pixels? Let's see how that looks. That is definitely not what I want. 70 pixels. All right. Let's check that out. Perfect. So that added some good space between it. I like that a lot. All right, so let's move on to creating some of our input fields. So let's make sure that we're working within the same row and our same column. So underneath our column, outside of this div tag, go ahead and press enter. And we've got some input fields, right, that we're working with. Well, you can also think of this as a form. So in the HTML semantics, there is a keyword called form. And this helps the browser identify, hey, there's going to be input fields here. This is type of a form. People are going to be filling stuff out here. Okay. Now in this form, we've got some header tags and then the form, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I want to wrap this in a div because in the future, there might be a styling property that I want to add to these group of elements that are in here. So inside this div, we want the font to be a little bit smaller than a header 1, so I'm going to do a header 2, and then remember it was username. And then we have the second header, and it was named password. Password has 2 S's in it, okay? So now we've got the second header in there. But underneath each one of these is an input field. So after your first header, go ahead and click enter, and then we're going to create an input field. All right, and then it closes off there. Now, what's really interesting is an input field, we can add a lot of cool things to this. So for an example, the first thing we're thinking about, well, let me see if this even shows up on the browser to show you. Okay, cool. So the first input field showed up. So we know that that element input has this default styling. So we know that we want to style it, make it bigger, things like that. And it's also empty. So let's come into here, and we know we're going to add a class to it. And I'm just going to put input box. All right. Now it is a little bit general, but for this example, because our web page only has one section that has input fields, I'm going to just put a standard input box. In the future, you're building a web page, you might have multiple input boxes for users to fill out information. Be sure to make those classes unique to those input fields, because who knows, you might be styling them differently. All right, so I'm going to put a class on this so I can style it now. And then I'm going to add a type of text. Now notice here that we have a type of button, checkbox, color, date, time, email, month, a number, password, all sorts of different things. The cool thing is by adding a type of text, allows us to identify, for example, this is a username input field, and it's type text, which means people are just going to be randomly typing things into it. By putting types on this, this is another way that in like JavaScript, for an example, we can cling onto this property in this element here and add functionality to it. So if someone was typing in their email and they hit submit, we could grab the type of email that's tagged onto this input field and add some functionality to that. But we're also, let me unhighlight here, we're going to be adding a placeholder. And let's just, this is going to say username. Okay, this is going to kind of help the user, guide them along of what to put in here. And I think that's pretty good. We've got a class of input, type text, and a placeholder. Now, if we wanted to get really technical of other properties we could add here, we could add a name to this. And in this case, we could just name it username. And this is another way that we can interact with this input element here. So we can add some functionality, and then this is also another way to interact with it. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and copy this right after your password header 2. Go ahead, hit enter, and paste it in. But obviously, this name will add as password. We'll keep it of a type text, and the placeholder is going to be password. All right. So let's go ahead and check this out. So you can see it's added our placeholder text. That is fantastic. Now let's add some style to this. Like, it's just way too small. So we're in our custom styles here. Let's head over right under the header 1. And we're going to grab our input. And this time we're going to use what's called an attribute selector. And we're going to put these block quotes and then the curly braces. Now remember how we said that with this type text here, it gave us a way to interact with the element. Well, what I'm going to do here is, because I want to be specific with these, say every input field that I have in my entire website, the ones that are type text, I want to add a specific style property. The ones that have a type of email or a type of date or a number, I want those to have a different style. So by being specific like this, again, it's another good practice of specifying the style properties you want to put on an element. So we know that we definitely need the font size to be bigger. It's way too small. So I'm going to add 20 pixels. The other thing I want to do is we saw that they were really short. So I'm going to add a width of 400 pixels. Okay. Now you could put this in a percentage. You could put this in pixels. The reason why I want to put it in pixels is because I know the size that I want it to show on desktop, like tablet and above, like tablet and desktop. And then in the future, we're going to be making a media query, a breakpoint for a custom width on this. Okay. Now, one thing that I do want to make sure is that I want a min width of 100 pixels. So what I'm saying here is no matter what happens, what screen size this is put into, I don't want the width of this input field to be less than 100 pixels because that's way too small to type in. All right, so let's check that out. Come over to my browser. Cool, so you can see that we made the typing bigger and we've made the input fields a lot longer. But you can see that the username and the text when I type in here is just all snugged up to the far left side and to the top and bottom. So what can we do to create some space within our input element? You were right, bingo, you guessed it, add padding to it, right? Because remember, padding adds space from within an element. Now, I don't want to add too much padding, just something small. I don't know, 5 pixels sounds pretty good, just to put a little bit of padding around everything. Let's go back to it. Oh, that's much nicer. You can see 5 pixels. Now I've got a space here and top to bottom. We got space. I like that. That is great. Now let's go ahead and get our font to be white. That's going to be our next objective here. All right, so what I'm going to do is our header 2 is nested in our form parent. So why don't we just come under our header 1 and type in form header 2. And what this is going to do in essence is it's going to say, hey, every header 2 that I see in a form tag, apply this style. All right, we could have added a specific class to it like we did with the header 1s. But for this case, let's just say every form. The header 2s, we want a color of white. And I think that might be good. Yeah, that's perfect. That's all we want to do, because we want the text size to stay the same. So I'm going back to my preview. Excellent. This is looking really, really good. So now that we've added the content that we want, let's go ahead and get everything to shift over some, okay? So come back to the text editor and let's think about a couple of things that we have to do here. We are working with the content that is in this first item, and we need to create some space from all of these elements that are inside this column from the left side of the screen. So I definitely know that I'm going to be working with a margin left, right? Because we want to add space to the left side of the screen. Now, what we can do is I could go ahead and grab the column, the col6 class, and add this big margin, left to it. But that means every single column 6, I would have this too. So why don't I go ahead and add a class to this class? And we'll name this left side call. All right, that's pretty good. So let's go ahead and copy this class. And in our hierarchy of things, I'm going to say in my custom styles that I'm probably going to want to put this right after the gradients, because we're working with backgrounds, which are a big deal. Then we're working with columns, and then we're working with our text and inputs. So grab your class with the period, paste it in there, and then we're going to add a margin left of, let's see, are we going to want to use pixels or percentages? Let's see, if we're making this mobile compatible, do we want a hard set in stone pixel distance from the left side of the screen, or do we want something that is going to be able to flex with our row? You guessed it, we want it to flex. So I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here and add 30% margin to the left. And let's go ahead and check that out. Refresh our browser. Now that pushed it over significantly. But because it's on a flex, before I go and I start testing everything, saying, no, I want the margin to be this, this, or this, I would rather build the second column and position those other elements and see how it affects the margin in here. All right. So let's stop there. This is a wrap.